Hello and welcome to Hobbies with Robbie. Today I have the imminent luminary of our time, Daniel Coffeen, who is known as a postmodern philosopher, a rhetorician. Is that right?
Well, you have an extra syllable in there, rhetorician. It's not a rhetorician. It's an extra.
I like my pronunciation better.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
and so but however, although we will doubtless touch on those subjects, what it's all about today is hobbies. And uh, when approaching Daniel to do this show, he made a very interesting statement, which is that he might like to talk about the figure of hobbies rather than hobbies themselves. So I'm very interested to hear what's that all about.
You're asking me? Is
Yeah,
this
what's
my?
the what's the
I,
what's the figure of hobbies?
when I hear hobbies, I think of something that's separate from your work, right? It's something on the side. It's some task you do that sort of reduces the thing, right? And what it does is assume work is the central aspect of your life, right? And hobby is this other thing. And I've just never broken out my life that way, right? And that if I had to like map out that the sort of relative privileging of these things, I would say my work is, I guess, a hobby. It's this thing I kind of do on the side, except I don't have desire attached to it, right? It's sort of just a necessity, right? But I feel like the things I do are not necessarily things I get paid for, right? So I never think about things I do as hobbies. They're the things I do. They're the things I love. The things I'm drawn to. The things that enthuse me, infuse me. They're not hobbies. It's not like I'm a dabbler. It's not like I work full time for IBM and I collect stamps on the side. You know.
Well, I know that postmodernists love bivalent ontologies, so I thought that I would mention my grandfather's collection of toy trains that he would only use on the weekends. That seems more like a hobby than what you're talking about. But I would like to ask you about your origin story, because all good superheroes must have an origin story, and I think of you as a kind of superhero, at least an intellectual superhero, and we'll get to that. But why not tell us a little bit about where you're from and what you're all about?
All right, that's fair. I was born in Manhattan, 1969, and we lived on the way, 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 way Upper West Side, up by Columbia, um, and my father left us all, so we were all living in this little apartment in the 70s in Manhattan, which was an interesting time. I don't know if everyone remembers, probably not, that this the movie, like the if anyone saw Joker, right? They use Newark, but they're trying to portray New York in the 70s, right? It's when the city went bankrupt, and graffiti was everywhere and crime was really, really high. But then, my mom remarried and we moved up 20 miles north, and I grew up predominantly in this sort of posh little suburb. And what I right on the Hudson River, about 15 miles north of Manhattan. Um, and why, to me, that's worth noting is that I think suburbia breeds raconteurs, breeds thinkers, breeds humor in a way cities really, really can't. Because all we do is sit around and talk, right? You got to be able to hold an audience. You got to be able to, enthrall people, right? Especially people you're spending all these years with, you got to continue to excite them. Girl I knew in first grade, if I want to have sex with her when I'm in like ninth grade, I gotta come up with a good spiel, a good shtick.
I
Uh,
like that. You just changed my opinion about something, because, this evening I was kind of disparaging a certain group of people, middle-aged people who I know who hang out in this certain cafe, and they get together every week and they have the same conversations about things which, I unfortunately, sometimes we think certain ways about people, and it just struck me that they talk big talk about stuff that they don't really know about, but there's a value to that that's intrinsically valuable. You just helped me open that up. So
yeah.
as you developed as a young person, then you somehow came to knowledge.
Well, yeah. So I was going to say. So the thing that happened, and I didn't realize it at the time. So I had these. So it was a public high school, but oddly enough, had a couple teachers who fancied themselves, communists, Marxists, and one great English teacher. And, I remember we read this essay in American History by Gabriel Coco, a sort of, Marxist historian, right, about the creation of the USDA, right? And it was about, and rather, the great sort of turn he makes in the argument is that the USDA was created as a way to save the meat industry, not to protect citizens from the meat industry, right? And I got super excited by that, right? And what I thought I was interested in was history, right? But it turns out when I got to college and I started taking history classes, I'm like, oh my God, this is so boring. I'm not interested in any of this. They're talking about why do I always talk about governments? Why always talk about treaties and wars? Like there's so much other things. And when I realized I was trying to tap into what I thought then was intellectual history, but that wasn't quite right either. So when I'm in high school, on the one hand, I have this history teacher, teaching sort of these revisionist essays. And on the other hand, I had this great English teacher in which we had to read like a shit ton of books from like 19th, 20th century British American literature. And every week you had to bang out an essay comparing two of the books. And of course, people weren't reading that many books, right? I think I read 9 of the books, a couple Jane Austen, but then how do you write these essays? And everyone else would read cliff notes, Monarch notes, summaries, and they would talk about the plot. And that just didn't do it for me. So what I would do is I would just open any book on the list and just read a few pages of it, and then look at another book and read a few pages of it and talk about narrative styles and formal structure. Right. So bear with me here, how it all came together. So then I get to college and I'm bored. History is boring the hell out of me. And I ended up taking this class with the great Philip Rieff, great Freudian theorist who's dead now. And we'd watch these movies and we had to give all these multiple interpretations, supersessive interpretations of the films. And I realized what interested me and what I learned in high school was not a love of English literature, not a love of history, but a love of the act of interpreting freshly, the act of making new sense of things. So then I ended up stumbling into something called cultural studies, which was a new department at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 80s, and read Foucault's History of Sexuality, and then Derrida, and I just had my mind just blown because especially Foucault, but Derrida too, his joy is giving these different interpretations of things, right? So for me, it was always less about what they're saying than how they're saying it. This very act of looking at something you think and then being told or being sort of nudged, invited to look at it in a completely new way. And once I got that just remains my hobby, remains the thing that attracts me always, endlessly.
Well, if I may interject for just a moment, you have just put so many wonderful jeweled hand grenades into the conversation that I feel that there's really needs to be some unpacking. And I wanted to mention that in a certain sense, you would have been a trailblazer, because by the time I was in university, which was in the early 2000s, we in our history department, I did history and I got through the whole boring thing. And actually, one of the really big figures, I think that you were actually at her university. Do you know who it was? I think it was Judith Butler.
Oh yeah,
because our history department did a lot of women's history, and so of course you can't have women's history in the current paradigm without Judith Butler. So I think that it's really cool that you came from this period where all this really fun stuff was happening, which has really changed the paradigm and in a certain way is sort of crystallized. So I have a funny feeling that you probably are really popular at the universities right now.
Yeah, I don't know. Universities never really took to me. That's a whole nother thing. My problems with academia and the way I write and think and talk never really fit. And I'll leave aside what happened with me and Professor Butler. She chaired my doctoral exams, and then I was her colleague, right, when I was teaching at Cal. And then let's just say there were some fundamental disagreements about what the role of the university is in people's lives in academia. that ended up driving me out. So I can't really think that I'm all that popular in such places, you know.
Well, that's good. I think all of the interesting people grift on the internet now, self included, I hope. So, it is good. Thank you for being here for us and providing so much interesting knowledge. Now, when you more recently, as you say, you're in a certain sense, your work in academe or outside of academe doing intellectual work is your hobby. And one of the things that I think you're very well known for is rhetoric. Can you tell us a little bit about rhetoric?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's funny because when I finished up my undergrad and I had been this history major, but I ended up creating my own thing. I think we ended up calling it history of consciousness, right? And it let me take whatever classes I wanted and put them all together. And I wrote my thesis on Foucault and Foucault's historiography. And at the time, so I thought I was sort of interested in postmodern critical theory. And at the time, there's really not many places doing that, right? And really there was UC Santa Cruz History of Consciousness program, which was already very political. It was already into a lot of identity politics. And then there was the rhetoric department at Berkeley. And so I knew I would go there. It was back when graduate programs weren't so competitive, right? So I only applied to Berkeley, and that's where I went, but I never really thought about rhetoric. It was never a term that had crossed my mind. It never really entered my vocabulary. But the rhetoric department at Cal is a unique program, right? Because it's the one sort of versed in critical theory and on sort of, rather than ever studying history, it's always studying the way historical things are constructed, right? The way history is constructed, right? People are doing science there, but it's not just science, it's how a certain scientific field is constructed. What are the terms of its sort of discourse and how it came to be. I'm one of the few people who actually got interested in rhetoric, right? And then if you look at academia now, rhetoric is generally usually either its own little department that's devoted to teaching writing, or it's a subset of an English department, but it's usually about models of the pedagogy of composition. As if you study rhetoric, you end up running a composition program, right? That is not what I did, and that's not how I define rhetoric, right? So rhetoric is this ancient discipline that I call the sort of art of, the logic and theory, or the theory and practice, the art of making sense of life, a life in motion while in motion oneself, right? So if philosophy is about trying to sit and create a construct, right? Saying, okay, I can stop, I'm outside the fray, and I can look at things and assess them. Rhetoric is more like the trickster. You're in the mix because there's no outside the mix. You're always already enmeshed. Truth then becomes something that's not necessarily prioritized, right? The philosopher is interested in what the ideal. They look at a system and try to construct it and say, okay, what's true? What's ideal? What's a mind? What's a person? The rhetorician comes along and says, it's all circumstantial. It's all perspective. It all depends on the time and what I want. And every situation is multiple, and I'm multiple in every situation. And what's good or right is perspectival, relative, and emergent. And rhetoric has always been that logic, right? From the pre-Socratics to now.
Well, that brings me to a very, very interesting question, because I believe that in many instances, you have referred to yourself as a sophist.
I do, yeah. First and
That's,
foremost, sure.
That's wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about your reasoning for that?
Yeah, well, again, so sophist is just it's like, to me, is interchangeable with the rhetorician. Why I like sophist is precisely because it has sort of this pejorative connotation, and so it's funny to me to call myself a sophist. Yeah, the sophist is the one again who's they're like a trickster, right? They're not trying to plant a flag and say this is the way things are, right? They move through situations, they're of situations. Bugs Bunny is a great sophist, right? He's not like the Pink Panther who's trying to paint everything pink, right? He's slipping in and out, right? He'll change clothes, he'll become a woman, depends on what the situation is called for, right? And he'll shed his identity, right? It's more about survival, it's more about finding your pleasure rather than putting a stake in the ground and saying, this is my territory, right? So the sophist is the one who's opportunistic, who poaches rather than steals, who treads on other people's territory and flips it to their own advantage, who makes sense from within the mix on the fly and is never tethered to like a set of principles or firm beliefs or an ideology, right?
It sounds fun.
Yeah, it becomes, I think, the ethics, right? So everything I've written about and talked about is about turning this strange logic of sort of an emergent ethics, right, as distinct from a morality, into a more dominant paradigm, right? So all our conversations about about the world are always framed in terms of what's good and bad, what's true, what we should be doing. And the rhetorician always says, or the sophist is always like, well, it depends. But the logic of it depends actually inaugurates another way of approaching sort of, the public sphere, right? It's not just selfish. That's a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding, right? That's not just the person getting what's theirs. It's about creating a kind of ethical construct that allows, I think, everyone to be themselves, to be different, right? Where a moral scheme, right, or a principle scheme wants everyone to adhere to some sort of meta discourse, right? We all do this, right? I mean, the example I always give is, the 10 Commandments, right? 10 Commandments, or, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. It's absolute. It's absolute. And the sophist is like, well, really?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, right? Sometimes it depends what's going on over there, right? What if it's, there's all kinds of situations in which it might be the right thing to covet, thy neighbor's wife. It's not another,
especially if he's beckoning with a rose in the window for you, but be careful, it could be a trap. A question again that comes up is, I think that we perhaps in North America, I'm Canadian, you're American, but I think that we have a very skewed understanding of both sophistry and rhetoric, because when we come up if anybody deigns to study philosophy here, which I understand is exceedingly unhip, but I suppose I'll just have to be square. When we study these things, sophistry is presented as something where the paradigm is set arbitrarily. And so your axioms or your base statements are set down in an arbitrary way, but then it becomes a solidified thing. So I had been running around for years saying to my friends in Chinese philosophy that Chinese philosophy is sophist in nature, but it sounds like I was wrong, because it sounds like the paradigm will not become crystallized in this genuine sort of rhetorical approach.
Well, it just pushes aside the very question of the genuine or the true or the absolute, right? And it doesn't mean those things go away. They're just not the only things, right? So often there's, I'm actually deep into a book I'm trying to write about pleasure. And pleasure is often seen again as like a hobby. It's something extra. It's something you do on your own time, something outside the norm, which is how we can spiral into this horrific culture, right? It demands 80-hour work weeks, and everyone's got insomnia, and everyone's popping SSRIs and Ativan, and right, just to survive, right? Because pleasure's been pushed so much to the side and associated with consumerism, which was the biggest dupe of all time, right? Because as like the Buddhists know, pleasure is always at hand, right? Pleasure is right here. Pleasure is feeling the wind on your face, right? It doesn't need anything else. But the structure of sort of global state-sponsored capitalism works against that figure of pleasure. So the point is, for sophists, it's not that we don't care about truth or the genuine or the good. It's just that those things aren't the only things to go after. They're not inherently privileged. That in any given time and place, in any situation, from any given perspective, the criteria shifts.
That is very interesting. So another thing, though, before we get on to pleasure, which I think really ought to be the main deal, but before we get on to that, I also wanted to mention that people also have this very funny understanding of rhetoric, and I think that people often view rhetoric as polemics.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always what you always hear. It's just empty rhetoric, right? Which is even redundant in popular discourse, right? Rhetoric suggests that it's empty. It's just the words, right? But if you look at it another way, sort of coming, let's say, out of Michel Foucault, French historian and theorist, right? It's discourse. The things you can say and not say determine the entire distribution of power and bodies in a culture, right? I mean, just think about when you're interacting with anybody, right? We meet somebody new, all the things we think we can say and not say to that person. That's discourse. That's the, you know, if you start saying certain things to them, if I just come up to you and start, you know, and speaking in tongues, I'll be considered insane. I'm outside the norm, right? If I'm just too immediately frank and I say, hey, you know, you got great skin or whatever the hell it is, or you're funny looking or whatever the hell the thing is, again, you consider you've broken certain rules. Those rules are discursive. They are rhetorical. They've been determined collectively and emergently through discourse, right? So rhetoric says, okay, not only is it not what's considered empty, right? But it is the very playing field in which we interact with each other and the way one interacts with oneself, right? The way I can think about myself, the way I'll frame, very way I will frame who I am and how I'm approaching this life, such as a hobby, right?
Oh.
We come to the world and we assume, okay, there's hobbies and there's something else. And the rhetorician goes, really? Are we sure? Are you sure there's such a thing as hobbies? Where'd you get that construct from? And that's why people generally want to punch sophists in the face, right? Because we don't let anything be, right? What I used to teach my students is questions are the most insidious thing in the world, right? So here's a great example I would always use with my students, which is, you know, asking a kid, what's your favorite color? Yeah. Seems super innocuous, right? But you've done a lot of things. You're assuming they need to have a favorite color, that things are hierarchized, right? That we choose one thing. Why can't I say, I like different colors at different times, right? I mean, that would be the best answer, but why even ask that question in the first place? Who's your best friend? Really? Don't I have different friends for different parts of myself? Isn't it always a multiplicity? Why does it have to be a hierarchy, right? And that's the realm of what people say is just rhetoric. That's actually everything. That's how bodies are organized in space and how we think about ourselves and what can even be thought.
Wow, so many dimensions there. My God, what a buffet. Holy. I'm glad that I got you here, man. So that is too interesting for me to even get my head around for the moment. So I'm gonna shift. I wanna ask you if this is okay. Maybe we can talk about Daniel Coffeen's genealogy of pleasure. And what I mean by that is how you have understood pleasure through your life at different times and where it's been going, where you see it going, where it's changed. That might be an interesting area of discourse if you're into it.
Yeah, it's funny. Writing this thing is really, because I've written about pleasure I've thought about pleasure for a long time, and I had some public exchanges with a Marxist about it once online, and I realized now I wasn't thinking that well about pleasure. I still associate pleasure a lot with decadence and indulgence, and that's changed a lot, even though it's also decadent and indulgent, right? Like I'm never going to poo-poo those things. But it's really during this last year, during the sort of lockdowns of the pandemic, and getting myself into certain situations, you know, it was very, very solitary, right? A very, very small bubble. It was just pretty much me, my son, and my ex-wife. You know, I literally saw nobody else for the past, whatever the hell it is, year. And which is, I'm pretty solitary, but I found myself indulging various habits or hobbies, just getting plain old fucking lit up, right? Deeply lit up. And the thing that really opened it up for me was I had a bunch of things I was working on through my body. You know, a lot of them are legal. So I highly recommend something called Phenibut to people, which is a amino acid. It's legal, developed by the Russian cosmonaut program, but it's a great inaugurator and progenitor of pleasure. Anyway, I was actually doing nitrous oxide whippets, which I think are the greatest thing in the world, right? Just outrageous. And I'm sitting on my couch, you know, and I'm doing these whippets. I got a nice, good I have high grade nitrous and a great nitrous dispenser. And each time I do these whippets, the pleasure is unbelievable. I mean, my body it's a full, not just a full body, but a full existential and physical orgasm, right? I mean, what's streaming through me is, I mean, ineffably sublime. I mean, I'm almost disintegrating into the ether. And yet, if you're standing in the room, you might not even know anything was happening, right? And that to me is super interesting, right? What is the role of pleasure and the public, right? And is pleasure, and while it was orienting around all these whippets and things, what I began to realize as I started writing this book is that pleasure, the one reason pleasure is poo-pooed is precisely because people say, well, you need the whippets to get your pleasure. You need something else, right? I was like, no. What the whippets revealed to me was the intense privacy of the experience of pleasure, right? That in a way it's unassailable, right? I'm having this experience, and in this culture of, hyper attention to all kinds of things like race and class and gender, we critique people for all kinds of things, but you can't critique my pleasure. My pleasure just is a matter of fact. It's just empirical. It's all scientific. It just happens. It's this absolute experience that sort of resists ideology, resists critique. You can critique how I got to my pleasure, but the pleasure itself is unassailable, right? It is simply a statement of fact, right? There's Louis C.K. did his cold open. It was like the last time it was on SNL. It was like I don't watch Saturday Night Live much, but I purposely watched his opening monologue, and he's talking about pedophilia. And he's like, no one in our culture, I mean, nothing is more shit upon than a pedophile, right? I mean, that's just the low of the low. He's like, but they still do it, right? He's like, when I eat a Mounds bar, I love a Mounds bar, I'll stop everything I'm doing. But if people treated me the way people treat pedophiles for eating a Mounds bar, I would stop eating a Mounds bar. But pedophiles keep doing it anyway. And he goes, the only conclusion I can draw is that it must be really fucking good, right? Yeah, it's harsh, right? But his point is kind of brilliant, which is we can legislate the act, and I'm not advocating for pedophilia, to be very clear, right? What I'm talking about is that the pleasure, we can make the act illegal. We can do all kinds of things with that person, but the act of pleasure stands outside of that. You can yell at me and persecute me and put me in jail, but I still have my pleasure. And that led me to the intense privacy of pleasure, which then led me down further and further into things like yoga and meditation as not escapes from the world, but as embodiment of a kind of autoeroticism, a kind of masturbation, and of intense physical existential pleasure with no need for anything else, right? So I went from this seemed like a super decadent state of me on my couch doing whippets to me meditating or stretching. And I saw them as continuous because the pleasure is mine. The pleasure is right here at hand. The pleasure is always here for the taking. I don't need anything else. And in fact, it's precisely the fact, I think, that pleasure exists outside the discursive, outside of even the juridical, outside of judicial, right? Like, you can make my action criminal, but you can't legislate my pleasure, right? Pleasure is this very strange thing, and it doesn't mean anything. There's no meaning attached to it, right? So it's this event that's free of signification, and therefore free of being taken up by discourse and legislated or controlled. You can control the certain things that might bring me pleasure, right? You can make certain drugs illegal. You can say you can't shtup certain people, and I get all that. And I'm not disagreeing with that or agreeing with that. I'm just saying that's irrelevant. What I'm talking about is that there's an experience of pleasure that is absolute, that is intensely private, that is non-signifying, and is always at hand, that is separate from, let's say, consumerism or from state. I hate using the word capitalism because we don't have capitalism. We have socialism for corporations, right? So it's like state-sponsored markets that they think they're the source of our pleasure, right? But no, pleasure is always at hand. So that was been my sort of progression from sort of a decadence to realizing the decadence couldn't be just me stretching. The decadence can be just me caressing my hair. It could just be me feeling the sun on my face.
I love it. Well, one thing that came to mind was that it's really rather amazing that you can have all of these small dogs in your living room all the time. Well, you really like to have whippets.
Ah, I get it. There you go. It's funny when
Sorry,
you.
I was thinking about that the whole time. But what I want to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned. One of the things that I really appreciate is that you're not concerned about pushing the slow down or the safety button on discourse. And I think that that's a really admirable trait, because personally, I push the slow down button all the time, just because I know I have an experience with the audiences who have paid attention to the things I do in the past, and I'm always very conscientious about that. But I also, in this show, I really want to go away from that, because I think that the whole point is, sorry to be autobiographical for a second, but the whole point of this for me is to talk to people about things that are uniquely personal to them, and also that don't perfectly fit in with the model of how we especially see public figures. But even beyond that, just the model of how we perceive ourselves as being with other people. Because when we engage in our passions and our hobbies, or those things which are uniquely innate to our persons, that's a point that even if it has a social element, it truly ascends the social in a lot of ways. And so everything that you touched on there, especially about the profundity of experience of pleasure. I would say it also goes beyond pleasure, but I think I like dwelling on pleasure because it's nice.
Yeah.
And I think this idea that practicing yoga or practicing meditation is in a continuum with taking whippets. It's totally. I like to use the SWIM model about these things, and
I do too.
currently I have too many things on my in my life to be able to do things like whippets. But another swim back in the day might have strongly agreed with that. And having come through that into being involved in things like yoga type activities and meditation especially, the continuum is profound. And so is that something that you came to within this year of COVID? Like I say, COVID's been a great year for me. I don't know about you, man. But
Same, no, same here. Yeah, it really was. I mean, came a little bit funny because it came out of a kind of tension where my last sort of serious girlfriend is a very practiced yogi, right? She owns a studio. She's been doing it a long time. I don't really do yoga, right? But I do a little with her, and she actually taught me a fair amount that it's not about adherence to a pose, right? A pose is like a possibility as opposed to a rule, and then it really is emergent. But then I still would run up with her against, my own will to consume other things, right? Like I'm sitting here drinking my cocktail, right? I'm a drinker, so I, again, coming from the swim model myself too, and getting to lesson, the reason I've become more frank is that my son now is 17, right? When he was little, I was much more cautious because, CPS and Child Protective Services is the most creepy fascist institution in the fucking world. And I was always terrified of getting a knock on my door because some asshole parent at his school mentioned that, it's his dad takes ecstasy or something, and I'm not saying I do. I'm not talking about that right now. One day, maybe. I imply it a lot. And I am a big fan of psychedelics. I actually wrote a blog post about why kids in high school should take psychedelics. So I guess I've been pretty open about some of these things. But what I found with her and her community was that she's also had some decadence, but she still saw them as opposed. Even when philosophically maybe she did, and maybe she'll listen to this maybe or watch this at some point, and we're friends, and she might squirm a little, but I think there's still an instinct that there's an asceticism to meditation and yoga, and that thought that it's somehow I have to say no to all those things, that they're opposed. And so I really got there on my own, right? And realizing this sort of this continuity, although she gave me this great phrase when I was talking about my pleasure book, she used the phrase inherent pleasure that I became sort of obsessed with, became sort of the whole introduction to my book, right? The pleasure is not added to life. It's an inherent state. I began trying to talk about being in the womb, and then I deleted that, but I was trying to figure out if that was a side of pleasure or not. Does pleasure have to know what it's experiencing? I don't know.
No,
yeah, it was COVID. We went through all this shit that got me there. Absolutely.
It's interesting. There's so many things I want to grab onto here. So this is very pleasurable for me. But this thing, I think the most valuable thing for me to grab onto right now is the idea of the separation that has to take place between people when they want to achieve this aesthetic goal. You said aesthetic, but actually there's an element to it which is aesthetic too, which is that there's and this is something that I've dealt with a lot, and I'm also I'm really interested in a critical genealogy of this type of self-cultivation practice, because over the years, having seen a lot of different stuff and studied some of it fairly deeply, what has occurred to me is that there is a representational model going on in the Western mind about what the Eastern aesthetic and what their aesthetic purpose is, and what actually happens in the East is quite different. So to give you an example, I once met a man who was involved in Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet, who was declared to be a living Buddha. I was really impressed, and he chanted and made me hallucinate. It was really cool. But then I found out like a year later that he had been in an absolutely vicious dispute with another Tibetan Buddhist who was also supposed to be a living Buddha, and that it got really ugly. So when we look at that here, we would say, well, he couldn't possibly be a living. Well, what the fuck do you know? I'm sorry for swearing, guys, but you know what I mean. And so I think that what you said there about the separation, it's so true, and that pleasure is bad to a person with strong aesthetic leanings, if that aesthetic tends toward wanting to achieve some sort of high power. And so the high power of the yogi and the high power of a political aspirant are very similar in a certain sense. So I'm sorry for going off on that tangent.
No, I love it. That's fantastic. Yeah.
So I guess that another thing that I wanted to briefly touch on is this idea of being in the womb. I don't know how familiar you are with Taoism, but the whole Taoist idea is that the world is pregnant, and that it's always creating, and that there's a mother and father aspect to the entire universe. And so the human sort of aesthetic goal in Taoism is actually to return back to the prenatal state and to go back to the womb. So that's why when you said, can you know pleasure if you don't know anything? It's like, oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I opened the whole book with the womb, and I just was thinking about what's an inherent pleasure, right? And I was thinking, just about relaxation, right? Like you've had a rough day and all of a sudden you just drop your shoulders, right? And you drop your jaw, and it's like, oh my God, right? Or you lie down on the sand, right? Or like I like to tickle my, the crux of my arm. I've been doing that since I was a kid. I think we all do, right? Or smelling my own hand, right? There's pleasures right there. And that brought me to like the womb. I was like, God, that must have been pretty nice, right? Like just, God dang, talk about decadent life, right? Just plug me in, man. I don't gotta figure out what to eat for dinner. I don't even really have to breathe. Just everything's taken care of. And then I stayed away, and I think this is my guess is you'll have an answer for this, and I'm kind of curious. Is the pleasure that's absolutely not knowing, right?
Oh man. Yeah, here's the thing. Like I struggle with this personally. This is I'm not a Taoist. I have friends that are Taoists, but I've always stood outside of it because I have this sort of impulse to retain my own personhood and my own uniqueness. That I understand that my Taoist friends have their own personhoods and uniqueness, but I've always felt that the constraints of joining an order and this kind of stuff is outside of my realm of interest, really. So, but
at some point
yeah.
I want to ask you about that, because isn't that also opposed to Taoism? Like I never really understood that, right? Like,
well, I don't want to
get into
bang
that.
on about it for too long, but just to give you a really quick sort of, I know Cole's notes didn't work for you in high school, but if you want to look into it more, you can. Basically, the thing started out as something akin to a philosophical tradition. Chinese philosophy has similar origins to Greek philosophy in certain ways. I wouldn't be surprised if they were kind of shaking hands around the back in some way. But the philosophical tradition got totally derailed because the first emperor of China decided to kill all the philosophers, basically buried about, I think, 400 of them alive and burned all the books. And he instituted this thing called legalism, which is still approximately the Chinese state model today. And the philosophy came back a couple hundred years later, but it sort of morphed into this thing which was sometimes quasi-religious, sometimes totally religious. And what it did was it entered into the folk religions of the states, or what was once these sort of disparate states that were now joined into a dynasty. And so the intersections and intertwinings of history are really complex. My reading of Taoism is one that says that the proliferation of deities is not as important as the big picture, but there's different ways of couching that and contextualizing that, and it's never been neat. It's never been nicely organized,
Right.
which is how life is, or that's how I think life is. And I think that that's something, again, to bring it back to you and what you're doing. So I came across your work because of Thaddeus Russell's podcast. And if we use the yin yang paradigm, you and Thad kind of have a yin yang thing going on, because you have this great affection for creation of newness, and that's this way that you use the not that you're only in postmodern thought, but that's the way that you use the postmodern. And Thaddeus, he sort of has this critical and like taking apart, doing the deconstruction and revealing the things that are inside that are not comfortable. And I think that this is a wonderful illustration, because to put on my best Jordan Peterson voice for a moment, man, if you listen to these guys, they're going to take it all apart, and there's not going to be any more Western culture, and the father won't be rescued from the deep, and you just you're going to end up in the gulag, man. You won't like it. So you better clean your damn room, act like a good lobster. And I think that one of the things that you do is that you reveal that, this project of intellectual creation doesn't have to be like that.
Right.
It's
Right.
cool. I don't necessarily subscribe or not subscribe to postmodernism, but what you're doing is so different from that typical perception. And I do think that it's interesting that you've brought a critique of international capitalism. I might not entirely see eye to eye with you about that, but your critique of it isn't, I mean, it's clearly not a hidebound sort of, 1950s American Marxist critique. And I would be, it'd be interesting if you would be willing to talk about that a little bit, and give us some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny that one of the disconnects. I mean, I love Thaddeus, and we are friends. One of the disconnects is that he'll mire himself in things that drive him crazy. So he'll watch fucking Joe Biden, right, and then write something about it. I'm like, Jesus, I haven't watched the news since I was 19, right? I won't do things that don't bring me pleasure. Why would I spend time? If I don't like a book, I don't read it. Every book I've read, I love. Every book I've taught, I love. I would never teach something that we wanted to say was bad. Like that's an energy expenditure that doesn't interest me. right? It's sort of funny thing because through Thaddeus, a lot of people I bumped into call themselves libertarians, and I've always been sort of confused about that, right? That you're into liberty, and yet there's such a weird dogma, right? And there's so much energy spent saying no to things and all saying, are we all libertarians? I don't want to agree, where I just want to be actually free. I want to be untethered from every possible ideology. I want to skirt between them like the sophist, like the trickster. I want to piece it together on the fly. I would never call myself anything, right? I see the Buddha on the road, I cut his ass down, right? Like I don't want anything. I would not call myself a Nietzschean. I would not call myself a postmodernist, right? I would not call myself anything, right? I have no desire to. I try to, without spending any energy, I want to evade those things, right? That's something I take from Nietzsche, which is where do you spend your energy? Everything's about energy expenditure. So I always find like Thad and his community love to fight things they don't like. And I'm like, God, I'd rather take whippets or fuck or write or do a million other things and spend my energy talking to you did a Jordan Peterson. I have no idea who he is. I've heard his name.
Oh, that's so
I've never
cool.
read one word. I've never seen one thing. I don't know who he is.
Oh my God, dude!
I don't know who runs for office. I never know who the president is. I don't give a shit. You know, I've never have known.
My estimation, I mean, my estimation of you was already pretty high, but the fact that you don't know a lot about, oh God, oh, I feel great.
Don't know who he is. I know his name's popular.
Man.
I know it gets bandied about, but I've never read him. I don't know what he looks like. I've heard him. I have no idea.
I'm not gonna ruin your life, man. That's so wonderful. So no, that's really cool. And it's something that you mentioned about libertarians, which they're I mean, hey, listen, I love them. I respect a lot of libertarians. They're very interesting people, especially their depth of study about various subjects. But at the same time, it's like their conception of freedom seems to be more of a thing that's about how you spend your money and theoretically how you're allowed to engage in society. But in terms of the practical social engagement, I mean, most of them are pretty puritanical.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah,
yeah. And so
like irony to me. I was like, yeah. Anyway,
it's the American way. It's one of the American ways.
Right.
I come from a German background, a Germanic background, and so I understand a bit about that. There's this those people who came over, including my ancestors. Now we were Empire loyalists, so screw you guys. Try to come into our country. We'll burn down your freaking house, man. You have to paint it white. Anyway, so but that there's that feeling there, which is if you want to see the sort of maximum extent of it, it's the Mennonites, or the I guess you guys called them the Amish.
Yeah.
So
I spent some time in Pennsylvania. I know what you speak.
Yeah. So, but I think that what you're bringing, I wish there were more people that were thinking like this. Like the closest person, and this is not a good fit, but the closest person I can relate your thought to is Terence McKenna, because he's so multidimensional. But again, he's still
he's an ascetic, right? So I'm working on this chapter on drugs and pleasure, and like McKenna would poo-poo a lot of the way I take drugs, right? I'm like, I don't need to. You only sit in the dark on fucking 5 grams of magic mushrooms. I was like, I don't need to do a heroic dose, man. Like, I can. He would frown so much on the way I dabble, because he's still going after the pure, the true, and I'm like, yeah, I want that also, but there's other things I want too, Anyway, so you're talking about like global capitalism. What Thad and I share is kind of growing up in, so-called communist households, right? And so I came out of that, although my real father was like indicted by the FBI and testified for HUAC and stood trial. But that was before I was born. But my like family heirloom was a leather-bound Das Kapital. And and when I was a kid, I called myself a communist, and I organized in my high school. I was student body president for a couple of years, and I organized a takeover. I wanted to take over the administration. I wanted them run out of town, and I refused to do anything like a prom or anything like that. It was all about student power. and funding parties. I realized that, right? Like I'd have events, take the money and buy kegs and half ounces of pot for the school. It wasn't for me, it was like for the school. And I think Thad and I both came out of something like that and realizing that how anti-freedom and how anti-pleasure, right? How those worlds are, right? While saying they're the opposite. So we share a fair amount of that. But yeah, my stance towards political has changed really dramatically in the last couple of years, to be honest. Like I definitely came out of, my gut was always a kind of socialism, where that was never that, right? That's sort of that's the libertarian side of him, right? That sort of radically opposed to socialism. And I was like, but I now am radically opposed to socialism because I got a whiff of another opportunity, right? Another bottom-up opportunity that's sort of radically capitalist. If you cut the state out of the equation, and that's my involvement with sort of the crypto anarchists and a startup I'm now part of that is dedicated to crypto anarchy, which is about building alternate governance models with alternate economies in which wealth is distributed however you guys all agree to it, right? So we don't need top down, just a sharing of the wealth when you can excise the sort of top corporate head hierarchy of a company, make it all distributed and decentralized. You can just, wealth can naturally be distributed. You don't need the government to come in and take money from one party and give it to another. You can build it into a smart contract, into an algorithm in which wealth is just naturally distributed because there's a tremendous amount of it. Especially if you're talking about an information-based economy, right? There's tons of money rather than it flowing up to the board of Google or the board of Facebook. It distributes to all the users. And all of a sudden you've eliminated poverty. You've cut out the government. There's a governance module built in, so you can all vote on whatever the hell you want, how you want money spent. And that's what's really changed my politics and turned me much more into, I guess, what people call an anarchist, but whatever.
I love it. Well, I did visit the website of the project, and I'm super interested in it. I already have a soft spot for cryptocurrency because one of the things that's really cool about crypto is that it changes, and change is a big value for me. And the idea that you can have a type of money that it changes because of people's preference, and I think that's really cool. But I would like to give you a little bit more of a chance to talk about and to plug what you're doing in this particular instance, because I think it has wonderful opportunities to liberate people in a lot of senses. So please, feel free to enlighten us a bit more and, mention the name of it. And okay, yeah. I'll aim to also put up some links and stuff.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. So it's called Anatha, Anatha, which is after Anatha Pandika, who was a disciple of the Buddha. And who was a businessman, but all the communities he built were all about raising everybody up rather than extracting wealth, right? So we call a structure of flourishing, right, of abundance, right, in which everything's created and distributed as opposed to extractive. Yeah, so what we've done is built, we're going to help other organizations, but one thing we built was basically an application in which, it's got some financial tools, it'll eventually have some social tools. And people buy in, they buy some token and they register their username, and all of a sudden, all the value that's generated on the network, rather than us keeping it, right, it goes to everybody else because we don't own it. It's decentralized. I don't know how much you know about the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization.
Nope.
It's worth saying again, right? It's called the DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization. It sort of displaces the corporation because so many things can run automatically with these smart contracts, right? So our network, we don't own it, right? We launched the code, but the code's all open source, and then nodes are distributed all over the world. It's already live, and we have a node, but there's like 39 other nodes that are not ours. So it's not ours. And the value that's generated through various people's activities, making transactions, eventually there'll be some social stuff. Maybe rather than that money coming up to us, like Facebook, right, it just goes back to the community. right? And we think that that's the future, right? So things like Spotify or social media, right? Facebook's such a great model because you get this company that built this thing, people come in and use it, they create the content, then you have ad people create the content, but somehow the capital all flows to the people who really did the least in any of this, right? They created the network. That's okay. They should recoup their money, no question about it. They should even get a little bit of money to keep it all running, no question. But should they keep all the money? It's a little weird, right? They're selling us, right? So the idea is with smart contracts, you don't need that anymore, right? That if you unleash all this information, all this value that information generates, right? Information is far and away the most valued asset on the planet, right? Displacing oil by an exponent these days, right? Where do you point all that value? Right? And right now it's still being extracted as if it's oil, right? So Facebook and Google function like ExxonMobil. They're just mining us. And that's why they were so quickly able to surpass ExxonMobil and all the oil companies, because they're using an economic model that's built on extraction, right? They can't do microtransactions. Picture you're on Facebook and you see an ad. Let's say you should get paid to see that ad, right? It's for your attention and engagement, but how could they even pay you? Let's say that you should get paid 4 cents for that, right? How can they pay you? It costs them more to pay you. Cryptocurrency eliminates that, because cryptocurrency, the pipes of money follow the pipes of information. They're one-to-one, right? So you eliminate the inefficiency of a top-down economic system and all its regulations, right? That's one of the aspects of it. So yeah, so that's what we built, right? So, well, we're having a wider token sale, public token sale in end of May. And I invite everyone to come and join, right? Because it's not self-serving. It messes with people's heads a little bit, right? Because it sounds like I'm pitching an ad, but it's not, right? Because we have another way to make money. We have a B2B, like we help other organizations do things. That's how we'll make money. And so it's a model that people aren't used to, and it's because of this DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, right? There's no central board extracting value.
Well, I'm really glad that you guys are according with the DAO, so that's kind of cool.
I know that's occurred to me, that play.
Yeah. So this brought something to mind. Sandwich, come here, buddy. Sandwich. Sorry, I got to call my cat over. Sandwich, come on over, buddy.
I like
Come on
Sandwich.
over. You want to say hi to the nice people? Come on. There we go. Sandwich is on screen.
Hey, look at Sandwich.
You want to get naked? Oh.
That's a big old beast. Wow.
He's a cutie, right?
He's adorable. He's also huge.
Yeah, he may just look big. He is a cancer survivor.
Oh, nice.
This year he had lymphoma. It was really scary. He was breathing in a way that was just terrifying to us. And we took him in and got him treated, and he's a lot better. So good for him.
Happy to hear that. Yeah, that's scary. Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to come to a question that came up for me, and I don't know whether you have any thoughts about this, but it's something that is on my mind a lot, and I suspect that if it's not on your mind, you will immediately have an idea, which is that when you talk about the extraction model of business which Facebook is using, and of course, which a lot of modern businesses use, because it's part of
the economic
paradigm, in a lot of senses, is based on oil.
Yeah.
Because oil is what has fueled the modern world.
That's right.
And I think that this other new paradigm that you're talking about, which is decentralized, it represents a sort of potential changing of the guards in a sense. Right. Because one of the things historically that always happens eventually is that the old paradigm runs out of steam or runs out of oil. And so a new paradigm has to come up to replace it. So what I want to ask you about is how you envision this movement of paradigms, because postmodernism also, of course, did that to modernism, and in certain senses, metamodernism, which is what I partially subscribe to. I don't like how much they like Carl Schmitt. I think they could like Carl Schmitt a bit less. But the paradigms always continue to shift and change. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is why it becomes a kind of what attracts me about the approach we're taking is that we don't need to go into the courts, right? So there's been some battles, especially here in California, trying to make Facebook pay its users for the information, a percentage. It's so fakakta, so complicated. All it's trying to do is reform a system that is inherently wrong, right? And what I like is what we call just bypassing. I just want to bypass it all, right? And move into a really hyper-capitalist mode and say, listen, here's a social network in which you earn money. Or you could stay in Facebook in which all your action makes money for someone else, right? And so we believe that will just be the natural flow. That what happens, what crypto one way to look at crypto, there's a few ways of looking at it. One way is that it turns money into a product, right? And it turns US dollar, which it is a product, right? And it makes it, rather than it just being the thing that runs everything, it turns out, no, it's a network that's been designed a certain way. And it's really designed to drive its main use case, right? Which is oil and bombs, right? That's predominantly what the money goes towards, right? Is extracting oil and building and dropping bombs. And that's just if you look at the distribution of how US dollars are spent, that's how they're spent and how they're created and driven back into that industry. So once it becomes a product, our thesis is that people will choose a product that aligns with them. We'll be branded. It will be, do your values align? Do I like the way this money is being spent? Do I want to be part of this community and this logic? And it's all transparent, right? It's just beautiful about the blockchain, right? That's the whole point of it. It's transparent. You can look at the code. You don't have to listen to anybody else. So my favorite piece of jargon that I learned in the crypto world is trustless. And when I first heard that, I was like, why is that a good thing, right? And now I get it, right? Because you don't have to trust anyone. It's not a question of trust. The network is transparent. That's what the blockchain is, right? And so you can look at the source code and be like, yeah, I want to belong in this community or I don't, right? And so I think there'll be a sort of a natural fleeing of the dominant model, just because it serves such few people, like literally very few people, like a few thousand, right? It really is detrimental to almost everybody else. And everything's been rigged, since Bill Clinton, right? Deregulated everything, right? He's our Margaret Thatcher, right? And so all the capital just keeps flowing in an accelerated way up, right, to these banks. And they, as we've seen during COVID, they just print money and give it to themselves, right? I mean, it's truly bizarre, right? And I think people are finally waking up and going, oh, this is a rigged system. They print money when they want, and then they just keep it, right? Maybe we'll give you a few $100, but it's like, where's the rest of the money going? That doesn't make any sense. And so we believe it'll just be natural. Like if you just let the markets play themselves out, and the government can come in and try to make something illegal. But the whole point of decentralization is, how? Right. And that's, one of the phrases out of crypto is these networks are unstoppable. Right. Because what do? Whose servers are you going to take down? Like, it's decentralized. Who do you arrest? What do you do? It just runs itself. As long as the code exists and somebody's running it, right? What do you do?
That's a libertarian's wet dream right there.
That's right.
So now I want to make sure that I'm understanding one particular thing.
Yeah.
So when we talk about trust and being trustless, I get the image from trust. I don't know why, but I see a man in the 1950s wearing a suit, holding out his hand to shake it and saying, our firm is a firm that you can trust. And what occurs to me is that at a certain point in the evolution of society and the evolution of business, we have had to establish trust relationships in order to get a sense of verification that whatever we were exchanging would be delivered.
Yeah.
But what enables us to become trustless, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that because it's decentralized, because the entire involvement is based on your own personal consent, and your consent is based on your own personal interest, and there's no mediator in the sense of having an immediate interactive
peer-to-peer.
exchange, right?
Yep.
Am I going in the right direction?
Yep. Yeah. So trust is huge, right? So one argument, I have a close friend who's, he ran a huge fund at Wells Fargo, and he's been suspicious about crypto, and he doesn't really know enough, and I'm beginning to convert him. But one thing he said is, well, one thing the banking industry takes care of is trust, right? You trust that when you're sending me money, I know it's you, the money's going to come to me, and I can track it, right? Where crypto, it's strange because while everything's transparent, I don't necessarily even know if you're a human being, right? I don't really know what's going on the other side. So what's emerging, and we will build on top of ours, is a trust network, right? And you can build what are called, like zero knowledge trust protocols, in which I can share information about myself with the algorithm, with the network, without sharing it with you. So I can maintain my anonymity, but you can still confirm that I am in fact a human being. I am in fact who I say I am, right? And so I mean, almost like Yelp, right? Yelp has a kind of decentralized trust system, right? It's sort of crappy, right? And one of the complaints against it is that it's often rigged or it can be gamed. But crypto, there's what's being developed in a lot of places, and including ours, is a kind of trust network, right? So that you'll know if you need to, you're dealing with who you say you're dealing with, right? Who you think you want to be dealing with. And then, conflict resolution is another whole protocol layer that's being developed. I mean, the speed of development in this world is so fast because it's all open source, right? So what it shifts away from is the Silicon Valley obsession with proprietary technology, right? So I have the coolest widget that can do this. Crypto eliminates that, and innovation comes elsewhere. So we believe innovation exists at the place of your economic model, at the place of your value system, on how you distribute money, on your resolution scheme, right? So all that stuff's being worked out, right? But it is all the transactions themselves are transparent. That's what the blockchain is. It's a distributed ledger that's visible to everybody.
That's awesome. I think that that's really cool. I also, another thing that came into my mind while you were talking about this is the idea of intellectual property. And that's always been, well, I shouldn't say always. I became aware of the problems with intellectual property about 3 or 4 years ago. Incidentally, a very funny thing is that one of my publications has been heavily plagiarized, and right when I was sort of having my awakening about intellectual property, I shouldn't say plagiarized, it's been forged or whatever. I don't know the exact word for it, but it is in circulation in a sense that is extra legal, which is fine with me because it brings more people to me. But right at the same time, I was sort of having this enlightenment about how nefarious intellectual property can be. But I have a sort. I'd like to present this question to you, looking at it from the other end, where we would say, man, like I totally get the argument of crypto people that the intellectual property and these sort of things can be hugely problematizing, especially to moving forward in any meaningful way. But at the same time, shouldn't people who invest themselves in setting up successful projects then be allowed to sort of have an authority? Aren't they sort of an emperor of
So I think that's a misunderstanding about crypto and open source, right? It's in fact a great advocate for intellectual property, right? And that's the whole rise of the NFT right now, right? So on the blockchain, your article would be an NFT that have a smart contract built in. So anybody reading it, right, would in some capacity probably kicking a little money to you, and you can construct it all kinds of cool ways, right? You can cut out Spotify and be like, okay, if I share your article somewhere and a lot of people look at, I get a little money too, right? So we all become marketers for each other. That's all up to the smart contract. So that's what the rise of the NFT is all about. All intellectual property go on the chain. What I'm talking about is, core code, right, for infrastructure. You know what I mean? Rather than that being proprietary and fighting over that crap, because it's already become a mess in our world, right? Like once one company lays down all the cell phone towers. Does another company have to go and do that? Really? You have to tear up the world again and lay down another set of fucking cell towers, right? Infrastructure at some point should be a shared protocol layer, and then people can build on top of that. And it doesn't mean it's, and some of that's of course proprietary, right? Like we're open source, but not every aspect of our code is open source, right? And our economic system is the innovation as opposed to the technology per se, right? It shifts the focus. But yeah, it's not opposed to intellectual property. Quite the contrary. It's a way of actually resurrecting intellectual property and rewarding content creators.
So what it sounds like you're getting at is the idea that, again, just like with your vision of rhetoric, that there's this ability to do things in a sense on the fly, but as an emergent sort of genre. And as reality changes around us, which it does, then we are able to go into that reality and make the agreements, and I use the word agreements just to create a sort of place to drop this concept into, where we could potentially engage in any type of rule sets that work according to that situation. Is that sort of correct?
That's exactly right. That's one reason I'm so attracted to it, right? That it's another funny thing when I talk to people who don't know anything about cryptocurrency. They always think, well, which one's going to win? Such a funny way of thinking about it, right? That's the old model trying to be laid on top of this other one. Like I believe that there will be, millions of cryptocurrencies, right? But at some point, you won't know, right? The complexity of that will all get pushed to the background, right? And you'll be able to move between networks really seamlessly, right? But it's really the post-nation state is what crypto inaugurates, right? Because you can belong to a network with its own values, its own economic system that's not geographically bound.
Yeah, and this really connects people too. This is the thing that I think is so fundamentally wonderful. And I would be remiss not to tell you that there you have, what's it called in the superhero comics where there's a bizarro world. There's a bizarro world version of you on the internet, and I dare not speak his name because I might get flayed for it by some people. But there's a bizarro world version of you who has like all of your ideas. I should say who has a lot of these sort of ideas about decentralization and what I would call sort of a tapestry model. But the way that he applies the ideas is like a top-down, regimented, fully statist but disparate sort of tapestry. Whereas what yours is doing is it's a bottom up,
exactly
coming from people and being returned to people, like a sort of a fountain in a sense.
Yeah.
I think what I mean. In some of my sort of more brooding moments, I will pay attention to these sort of more, I don't know what to call them exactly. I like to view them as sort of dark thinkers, because it fits a certain aesthetic at 5:30 in the morning with my cup of coffee. But I honestly have to say, I think I like your model better.
Maybe on the side you can let me know who this person is. I don't dabble. I don't, my world's a very closed, weird world of my books, and my time on the internet is really focused on different things than that. Let's just say on pleasure, rather than, I really don't read or poke around, or I've actually never listened to a podcast. No offense. I've had my own podcast. I've been on podcasts. I never even listened to my own. So I don't know much. I don't know things.
That's great. Well, every different person has a completely different sense of what it means to inhabit one's own world. And so I would not ever dream to tell anybody what to do to bring themselves pleasure or to bring themselves frustration, right? As you mentioned before, there's many people who find no greater pleasure than working themselves into a froth about whatever thing they're afraid of. So I mean, obviously that's an enjoyable activity, even though it does bring stress. I think of it perhaps, as being akin to having a bit of a meth thing going on, in a certain sense. Not to knock meth, but it sort of seems
a lot about this, right? I mean, he says the whole Judeo-Christian tradition is a will of masochism, right? Nihilistic masochism, right? It's the hair shirt, right? They enjoy their pleasure is denying themselves pleasure, right? And he says that he thinks it's a sickly will. It's a will to nothing, right? And that's still the prevalent will, you know.
Well, as long as you get off. But the thing I don't like is that it becomes something that you have to map it out onto other people. And I don't believe in beating out punishments based on one's own neuroses. Unless there's an agreement there, and the social contract is not strong enough to get me to self-flagellate. So unless I want to.
Exactly. Yeah, I am with you completely.
This has been really cool, man. I think that we're moving toward a point where we can probably start to slow it down and wind it up. If you don't mind sticking around for a sec afterward, I'll just have a quick word with you. It's been incredibly fun. Now, I would like to also ask you to please tell us a little bit about your publications and how people can find out more about your fascinating way of thinking. There's a good reason why I wanted to have you on here, because there's nobody else like you. There's lots of people who are kind of similar to them, but there's nobody else like you that I've seen so far. Maybe in Swaziland, and he speaks. What do Swazis speak? But anyway, so plug your stuff, man. Tell us.
No, you're very, very sweet. I'm honored and flattered. Because I write a lot, but I don't publish a lot. But I did. It's funny. This is a coincidence. I just have a stack of books out here, including my own book, which again was a total coincidence. It's just I don't know why I pulled it out recently. Check something out. There's my book on 0 books. Reading way of things towards a new technology of making sense. Yeah, I recommend this book. It's fun. There's some things I've changed about it, but it is my model of rhetoric. It's sort of my, and what I would the thing I recommend about it, right, is it's not academic, it's not jargon riddled. I talk about martini glasses and the movie The Matrix and giving a massage and what you eat for dinner. And despite the back of the book description, I'm trying to wrap up this printing so I can reprint it with a better back description, which makes it sound philosophical. But it's a good, easy read. It's fun and short. I think it's good. It makes me laugh once in a while.
Is it true that you swore a lot in your thesis statement?
Well, first, if you look at my lecture, so the only thing I ever really created that I'm super proud of is with the lectures that were recorded by UC Berkeley from my Rhetoric 10 class, that eventually the department didn't really like me, and they finally had, Apple take it off of there. You can still find it though if you Google me and my lectures, Rhetoric 10 lectures. They're fucking brilliant, and when I listen to them now, I'm in awe of how smart I used to be and how lit up I used to be, because I'm moving a mile a minute in a way I just don't think I could anymore. But they are profane. And to give you a little backdrop, at one point, so I was teaching the introductory lecture. No one wanted to teach it in the rhetoric department. So I was adjunct. I was not a tenure track. I've always had other work. I make money other ways. And it's a pretty big lecture, and one of the TAs went to her thesis advisor, who was chair of the department at the time, whose name was Judith Butler, who so at this point had gone from being the chair of my exams, not my dissertation. I removed her from my dissertation, but she chaired my exams, and then she was chair of the department. And she called me, she beckoned me to her office, and she told me, she's like, "Well, I hear you curse in your class." And I'm like, yeah, like a fucking banshee, like a goddamn fucking banshee. I just let loose, man. And she's like, well, you can't do that, quote, because it offends students' moral and religious beliefs. This was told to me by the woman who really invented feminist queer theory. And I really respect Professor Butler. I think she's really fucking smart. She taught me Hegel. A lot of people don't know she was a great Hegelian scholar. But vis-a-vis the institution, I had such a massive disagreement with her about the role of the academy, right? And she just believed teaching was nonsense. You don't care about undergraduates and their clients, their customers. And I just didn't believe that. So those lectures are super profane. My dissertation is not as profane, but I do curse in it. Like if I need to curse, I curse. You know, like I believe that profanity is a kind of italics, right? It's beautiful. I want to be able to use every word in discourse, right? There's no word I won't use really. And the profane is fantastic. So my lectures are super profane. And I curse I curse when I write. I curse a lot more when I talk. Because it's like italics, right? Like it's verbal italics.
I like it. Well, that's wonderful, and I think let's wrap it up. But
Okay.
I hope that one day that I can have you back in this little space and we can unpack more stuff
Yeah,
because
be honored. Yeah.
it seems like there's an endless amount of possible stuff to unpack, and it's nice, and it I hope that it brought you pleasure. It certainly brought me pleasure.
Yeah, you do a great job here. And I like that you have this whole other thing. I wish we got more into that at some point. All the stuff you know, which you could teach me about too, would be great.
Well, I was thinking a few days ago, every once in a while, I'm very vain in some ways. I try not to be because I guess I've been brainwashed by the dominant culture. But in some ways, I'm very vain. So every once in a while, I'll do a Proustian questionnaire, and but I need somebody to interview me for the show.
There you go.
So maybe I could get you to do that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That'd be
That's
so nice.
Yeah, I'm in. I'm in.
Anyway, thank you so much, Daniel Coffeen. I didn't mention this. I would be remiss not to mention it. I drank some caffeine before talking to Daniel Coffeen, but if you think about it, caffeine. So I also had a cup of decaffeinated coffee.
There you go. See?
Thank
See?
you so much. Please stay on the line.
Yeah, I will.
The line.
I,
And
yeah.
this has been Robbie's Hobbies with Robbie's, and you have been listening to and seeing Daniel Coffeen, and awesome. So see you next time, guys.